Thank you to everyone who's come to this pitch session. I hope you can hear me okay. My name is Joshua Walker, and I'm the Director of Programs at the Congo Research Group. With me is my colleague, Pierre Boisselet, who is the coordinator of the Kivu Security Tracker project. So yeah, our presentation today, which is going to be a pitch session on the KST, as we call it in short, is about the process of quantifying, mapping, and analyzing violence in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. So I'm going to start with a few words of introduction and then pass it over to Pierre. So first of all, why did the Kivu Security Tracker come into existence? So this is a project that's been in existence since 2017. So it's coming up on 4 years now. And one of the first reasons that we decided to create this project was in order to sort of get a better handle on the conflict in violence in the Eastern Congo. So for those of you who don't know a lot about the Eastern Congo, and probably even for those of you who do, you will know that it is extremely difficult to keep track of the various different armed groups that are operating in that part of the country at any time, the kinds of violence that are occurring there. So as I've noted here, currently in our most recent exercise mapping armed groups in the 2 Kivu provinces of the Eastern Congo, we identified over 120 armed groups that have different agendas, different tactics, different regional affiliations at some point, in some cases, armed groups that go from very small to much larger. And just to give you a sense of that complexity, I'm going to show you a slide quickly. So this is just the map of armed groups that we did for North Kivu province in the most recent exercise from October 2020. And as you can see here, it's a sort of incredible patchwork of overlapping areas of influence. Obviously, this is not an exact exercise because these kinds of influence are obviously shifting and sometimes transient, but this gives us more or less a sense of which groups are operating where. And this is only in one of the 3 provinces that the Kivu Security Tracker works on. So as I said, we decided to create this project, first of all, to try to make sense of the complex conflict happening in Eastern Congo by both tracking and mapping violent incidents. So the security tracker includes every incident of violence that we can properly triangulate. So who, when, where, and the type of incident. And I think Pierre will talk about that a little later. And then sort of one of the broader goals of this was to try to use this quantitative data in conjunction with qualitative research on the side to identify trends, inform policymaking, and the Congolese public. So for instance, in the first biannual report that we released in 2019, we took some of the data and then did a broader analysis to try to answer questions like, where do most kidnappings for ransom occur and why? Is it true that more incidents of violence occur closer to mines? And the question of the relationship between extraction and conflict is obviously an important one. So in addition to doing our own analysis that sort of tries to take a step back and see the forest for the trees, because all of this data is available publicly on the Kivu Security Tracker website, we've also sort of helped to facilitate further analysis by making all that data public. And in fact, I believe that ACLED uses the Kivu Security Tracker data itself in its own tracking of Eastern Congo. So with that said, I'm going to move quickly now to describe who's part of it and then pass it over to Pierre. So as we mentioned, I think in the invitation, the Kivu Security Tracker is a joint project between the Congo Research Group, which is based at CIC at NYU, and Human Rights Watch. And it's run by staff that are based in New York, in Kinshasa, also in Eastern Congo, in Goma and Butembo, as well as a network of 17 focal points. So each territory, which is a sort of its subunit administratively in each province, each territory has one focal point who's responsible for gathering the data for that territory. And so These 17 focal points are spread across North Kivu, South Kivu, and more recently, Ituri province, which we've been covering since April of this year. So now I'll pass it over to Pierre.
Thank you, Joshua. So I'm now coming to how we operate. So as Joshua said in the introduction, there are several challenges when it comes to gathering data on the conflict in Eastern Congo. There are actually two main contradictory challenges, which are first, the lack of data from some parts of the country. Some of the areas we cover are still without any mobile phone network, let alone internet ones. And so it's very hard to gather data from there if you don't actively look for it. The other challenge is the abundance of unverified reports. Nowadays with WhatsApp, which is very used in Eastern DRC, and smartphones, we do receive a large quantity of reports. But the problem with them most of the time is that they're not verified. As Joshua mentioned earlier, we think there is over 120 different armed groups in Eastern Congo. And each of those actors have an interest in manipulating information. They may want to hide what they did wrong, or blame other actors for what happened in order to make them look bad. And then that also involves state actors. The Congolese army, for example, or politicians may have an interest in spinning information, as we'll see later. And so the way we designed the project was to recruit these researchers that we call focal points. We selected them based on their professionalism, based on the networks of sources they have in their area. So some of them are journalists, others are members of civil society organizations. Others can be researchers, academic researchers. And they are located in the very territories where the violence happens. And we have trained them to implement a strict methodology to gather information. So every time there's an incident happening, and I will explain later what kind of incidents we're tracking, every time an incident is happening in their territory of responsibility, they are filing a report to us that must include at least 3 different sources, confirming the information with all the details possible. And the GPS coordinates of the incident. And we gather all of that in a database. That's basically the foundation for our website and our analysis, everything we publish, basically. And so maybe now I'm going to show you what it looks like on the website for those who may not know our websites. Okay. So I hope everyone can see that. This is the Kivu Security Tracker website. This is the homepage. So it is basically a main dashboard of what's happening in Eastern Congo. So that's the number of victims we've recorded since the project started in 2017, over 10,000. The number of incidents, so you can see that incidents occur very frequently. Actually, there are several a day on average. So that's a lot of work to verify all of them. And other informations, Here are the latest, most serious incident we recorded. I don't know, I can show you an example, maybe here. With the number of victims, the date, the location, etc., and the small narrative. All of those incidents are also displayed on our map. And that's one of the things that helps us the most with trying to analyze the incident. So even from here, you can see rather quickly that the type of violence may vary a little bit according to the locations. So here, for example, you can see this is the Beni area. And you can very quickly see that the type of incidents we record in this area is mostly killings of civilians. So that's the light blue dots. But in other areas that may vary, so the purple dots are clashes, for example. And you can see, for example, Joshua mentioned earlier, the kidnappings, for example. So those are the green dots. If you zoom in, you can see that some areas have a lot more of those than others. And you can see, for example, this is what we call the Ruzizi Plain. So it connects Bukavu to Uvira, which are two of the major cities in Eastern Congo. And you can see that kidnappings happen very often, for example, on this particular road. And for example, we think this is partly due to the fact that the borders with Rwanda and Burundi have been closed due to COVID. And many travelers used to pass by those countries that are safer and are now forced to use that road. So that's one of the examples of the trends that it allows us to track. We also have a graph function to keep track of the incidents in time, for example. So here I'm displaying the number of civilians being killed by armed actors every month since the project started in June 2017. But there are other kinds of incidents you may be interested in tracking. We also collect data on mass rapes, kidnaps for ransom, clashes, political repression, destruction of property, and abductions. So you can play with, if you're interested in understanding Eastern Congo a bit more, you can play with all those functions. We have the same on the map tool as well. You can select a specific armed actor you want to track, specific point in time, location, etc. So one of the products this allows us to put together is the mapping of the armed groups. This is one of our most popular products, I believe. Since we are able to locate the various incidents and connect them to specific groups, that helps us inform what are the area of operation of each armed group. And that's what I'm showing now. There's a PDF version of the report we published in February this year, but this is the interactive one. And so you can see those are the areas in which a particular group is susceptible of operating. And if we click on there, we have included a small description of each armed group. So for example, you may recall that in February this year, the Italian ambassador to the DRC was killed. It was on this road right here from Goma up north, around in this area. And so that can very quickly inform us on which are the primary suspects of this incident. And for example, the closest one seems to be the FDLR, but some other groups are also able to operate in the area. You can also find the description of each armed group in this, under the armed group button of our websites over here. And so all of this data also helps us put together pieces of analysis of the trends in Eastern Congo. We try to have them regularly. And so, yeah, so you can find those analyses on our blog with the address here. And one of the other tools we use to report information very quickly when it happens is our Twitter handle. And so, for example, that's a report we published yesterday about the killing of a religious leader near Beni. And that's very useful for us to try and have accurate and triangulated information put out in the conversation very quickly. And so this is the PDF report of the mapping that I mentioned earlier, that you can find on our websites using the report button as well. So now I'm going to on how all of this data and this visualization can be useful. So maybe Joshua, if you can go back to the main presentation. I can, yeah. So first, in the specific context of Eastern Congo, I think that the mere fact of sending accurate and triangulated information, posting it, reporting it at least, can be useful in itself to help diffuse tensions. So here is a headline that went into the Congolese media on the 20th of July last year. And it was, I mean, many articles were along those lines. It reported that over 200 civilians were killed in a single incident in Kivu, that's located, it's a village located in South Kivu. And this information was basically sourced out of the of politicians, the MPs from the South Kivu province, provincial MPs. But as we were tracking this specific incident, yeah, we can go to the next slide. We had reports that were nowhere near there. The first reports we had on the day after that happened was that 5 civilians were killed. We later updated that and found that it was 18 on the very same day that the Congolese, some of the Congolese media were, you know, having those headlines on over 200 killed. Well, this is not to say, obviously, that 18 civilians being killed is not a problem. It's a huge problem, obviously. But then the risk of the political manipulation that was going on was that it may have contributed to escalate the conflict. And that mainly because it was used to stigmatize a particular community, of which the armed groups that committed this massacre were part of. And so this report we sent was luckily seen by a number of media, and there's an example in the next slide, where it allowed the media to question the manipulated figures that were published elsewhere. And so here, for example, is an article for RFI. I think there's a section next. Yeah. And we were lucky enough for this information to have been also reported by some press agency, in particular AFP, who have a large audience. And so that's one of the examples with which we think providing accurate information directly helps de-escalating conflict. Another way our data and analysis can help, we believe, is how it can help assess the success or the efficiency of policies. So staying on this area of South Kivu, of the Haut Plateau of South Kivu, where this inflated massacre occurred, several NGOs and international organizations tried to take initiatives to try and make communities come together and decrease the level of tensions. We've stated how Eastern Congo is a very complicated place due to the number of armed actors. But this is also true to some extent of the international organization landscape as well. There are a big number of NGOs and international organizations having operations in Eastern Congo. So one of the initiatives that was taken was to gather representatives of the various communities that live in South Kivu, and of whom various armed groups claim to defend. So in one instance, for example, all of those representatives were gathered in Kinshasa at the end of the month of March to try and have them talk together and come up with solutions on their conflicts. And what our data shows, and this is on the next slide, is that actually this didn't have a notable positive impact. So here you can see the latest dot it represents the number of clashes that occurred in the Uvira territory. That's probably the busiest, the most active area in South Kivu. And you can see that actually the month after those talks were held was one of the most violent we've ever recorded, actually, in terms of number of clashes. And this data helped us to start questioning those processes. Were they really efficient and useful? And that led us to a blog post. Maybe we'll see that in the next slide. Yes, questioning the use of that kind of initiatives and that kind specifically of dialogue. And that helped us trigger debates within the NGO community, the donors, and the diplomats, of which we are part of, and we hope that that kind of analysis and data can help trigger more efficient processes in the future. Another example of this is the situation in the Beni area of North Kivu. So many of you probably know that this is an area in which regular massacres happen. Most of them are carried out by a group called the ADF, who originates in, whose main members, at least founding members, were Ugandans from the Muslim community. And they have been in Eastern Congo for over 20 years now. And one of the way they operate is by do massive killings of civilians. So when that was especially true since 2014, where a big wave of massacres occurred. It was one of the first, at least the first of this scale. And so when President Tshisekedi came to power in 2019, that was a problem that was very high on his agenda. And in October of 2019, he decided to launch large-scale operations by the Congolese military to try and remove that threat from this specific area. However, what our data is able to show is that this actually triggered a lot more massacres than before. So this is the data per quarter of number of civilians being killed in the Beni territory. And so there was a huge spike of massacres immediately after the military operation was launched. And so this is a way with which the ADF retaliates to military operation. But what we can even see in our data now with a bit more time is that even on the long run, at least so far, we've not seen any positive consequence of this military operation. As a matter of fact, the level of the number of civilians being killed remain much higher than what it was before the military operation. So that is quantitative data, but our mapping also informs that kind of policy. So these are the locations in which the massacre by the ADF occurred before the operation started and after the operation started. So historically, the ADF were known to have their strongholds in an area called the Death Triangle, which is roughly where it's written Tungudu on this map. I hope everybody can see that. And so before 2019, they operated from those bases. There are other ones, but for the sake of this presentation, I'll try to keep it a bit more simple. So you can see that most of their massacres in the past used to occur on the road between Beni and Eringeti. We can see very clearly this axis over here. And those are areas that are roughly accessible from the ADF strongholds. What happened after the operation is that the massacres tried to spread out. We can see near the border with Ituri to the north, areas that were not as impacted before started to be to witness a huge number of massacres. And this also happened to the south in a sector we call the Rwenzori, that is known as Rwenzori actually. And what that shows us is that actually the military operation that targeted the main strongholds of the group and that did make some inroads in those strongholds didn't actually manage to capture the fighters. And they managed to escape and keep on doing massacres actually on a larger scale further. And to us that shows, and we think our data help to show that the way this operation happened was not efficient, and that rethink is necessary in the future so the Congolese government can fight this particular group. So that were some of the examples with which we think our work can be useful. We wanted to keep some time if there was any question. I think we must have, 12 minutes remaining. So if there is any question from the audience, now is the time. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, I see Paige has a raised hand.
Okay.
Hi, I had to go off mute. Thanks a lot, Joshua and Pierre. I actually have a lot of questions, so maybe I'll just start with two, and then we'll see what else comes up in the chat. But I did have a question about whether you are currently using the data to assess rising risks for violence in a kind of preventive or early warning way, or if you have plans to do that in the future. Or if you're not doing it, what are the obstacles, I guess, for you in doing that? And then in a very kind of separate way, I'm curious about the practicalities of this and your own reflections on what it takes to really implement an approach like this. You know, if others on the call are thinking about this as a possibility in other countries, how sustainable is it over time? So if you could address those, that would be great.
Okay.
Maybe Pierre, do you want to? Maybe you can start with the first question, and then I'll answer a little bit the second question, and you can then add something.
Absolutely. So I would say it depends on what you understand as an early warning system. We do not believe that our data can inform local civilians on, a threat coming their side, and the best way to shelter from it, because it will probably always take us more time to have the information and to triangulate. So by the time we release it, it's probably too late to be useful in a way that is, for those who can be directly threatened by armed groups. However, what we do try to do with this is to track signs of a new crisis emerging. Incidents are not necessarily the best way to do that, in the sense that, well, obviously when incidents are already happening and are recorded and triangulated, so it's already late. However, our network of researchers that are on the ground, they also collect a number of information that is not necessarily possible to encode in a database such as ours, but that we keep track of. And this is what we use to nurture our monthly reports. I didn't really present that earlier, but if you're interested in receiving such reports, you can sign up for our newsletter on our homepage. And yes, in this section, we try to state emerging trends. And we also are in contact with decision makers on a daily basis, often diplomats or workers from NGOs or international organizations. And we do exchange information on this. Joshua, did you want to take the next one?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, on the question of sort of how an operation like this works and how sustainable it is, I mean, I hope that, as is obvious, it's incredibly labor intensive. There's obviously, like I mentioned, we have 17 focal points across the 3 provinces, plus I think 3 other full-time dedicated staff, as well as a number of other people working part-time on it. And so there's a lot of work that goes into, as Pierre was alluding to, both the focal points triangulating the incidents of violence in order to make sure that we have accuracy, and then entering all that data and coding it and entering it into the website, in addition to all the sort of higher order analysis that we're trying to do concurrently. I mean, we've been lucky that we've had sort of fairly sustained funding for this project since the inception. But it's something that requires, I think, a lot of dedication, but also, this is, with I think maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, the group of focal points who we're working with today are the same people who were there at the very beginning of the project. And so, I think we found it incredibly important to sort of develop certain kinds of familiarity and working relationships with the focal points in order, I think it took, I wasn't at CRG when the project began, but I think it took several months to sort of build up to a particular kind of rhythm of work, and sort of make sure that everybody was on the same page in terms of methodological standards. I see another question here quickly. I don't know if Pierre wants to add something, but there's a question here about how are local researchers kept safe?
Yeah, I can take that. There are actually 2 questions, and I think I can take them at once because they're both about our researchers. So about the source, as we stated earlier, so we have our own networks of researchers, and we want that to make sure that we have accurate information. And how do we, so maybe to finish off with the source, maybe. We have the reports from our researchers who are on the ground, but we also check for the accuracy of their reports. Actually, we check their reports on 2 levels. First, the comprehensiveness. We use other databases that are not public, that are mainly meant to assess the security situation for NGO workers, but to which we have access to, and that helps us making sure that our researchers are indeed recording all of the incidents happening in the area of coverage. The other way we check their information is the accuracy of it. And so we regularly call to make sure they don't make up any of those sources. And also we use other sources of our partners, Human Rights Watch, that are also on the ground, to also triangulate those information regularly using another perspective. How do we keep them safe? One of the way we do that is actually to make sure they are not publicly connected to our organization. We understand that if some of the information were to implicate the responsibility over a particular armed group, and that happens often, obviously. And when we publish that, we don't want them to be able to go after the sources that allowed us to file these reports. We also have a protection fund that we use to remove them from the area should they feel any threat. That doesn't happen very often, thankfully. But yeah, we have plans in place to have them out of the field when needed.
Pierre, there's another question. There's two more questions now in the chat. One which is, I don't know if you see that, asking about saying that one of the barriers to acting as an early warning system for members of the general public is the time required to process the information. And is there anything that can be done to accelerate that process? I mean, I'll say something quickly about that, and then I will let you follow up. I think the question, you know, the dilemma of the KST project is obviously trying, you know, the balance between the speed with which information is published and the accuracy of that information. And I think that we've been, you know, we tend to be extremely, extremely cautious about what we publish in terms of accuracy, because, you know, part of our legitimacy rests on that accuracy. And so, you know, the risk, the reputational risk for, say, putting out a big kind of a warning about a pending attack that, you know, may not materialize is pretty great. And I think, so there's a sort of back and forth between the public and private dimension of the tracker, because on the one hand, we do have to be very careful about what's publicly mentioned. And I think it's more sort of, and I guess this isn't exactly a kind of formal early warning system the way it's sometimes conceived, but there's this sort of back channel private discussions that can be had with policymakers as we see things emerging, but that can't be confirmed with enough, you know, with enough solidity to be able to publish them. Paige had a question. I don't know, Pierre, if you want to take Paige's question about if there were more data points to be added, what would they be?
Yeah. One of the ways we can, that make us think that there might be a security issue developing in a certain area would be, for example, having an armed actor, you know, changing its location, or recruiting, or having managed to loot armed deposits, or, for example, displaced communities settling in a new area that can typically create new local drivers of violence. One of the data points that could help us a lot more with that would be satellite data. That's one of the things we've been thinking about, but for now we don't really have the capacity to have you know, real-time such data precise enough in real time, and so that's still a project, I guess.
I've just received a message from the moderator saying that we need to wrap it up. We're right at 9:45 now. But thank you very much for everyone for attending and for your thoughtful questions. It was a really nice opportunity to sort of do this kind of holistic expose and presentation on the Kivu Security Tracker. Thank you.
Thank you.